Our next speaker is Christina Theodore-Oklota. She's with Mahzi Therapeutics, and she's going to talk about clinical trial readiness. That's what we need to do to get ready to get our community into a clinical trial. Welcome.
So good morning, everybody. I'm going to talk a little bit about clinical trial readiness today, which some of this may sound familiar because I presented it a couple months ago, but I was asked to present it again because it is such an important topic for the community, and now is the time to start doing these things. Before I jump into that, I want to talk a little bit about Mahzi, the company that I'm with. So Mahzi means together in Greek. And this graphic really highlights how we view the drug development process and working together. We're a tiny biotech company focused on collaborating with multiple groups, including, most importantly, patient groups like yours, to really develop my coffee's just kicking in. All right, to develop treatments for rare neurodevelopmental disorders. That's also like a big chunk to say at once, though. So we work across all these different groups because we really believe that in order for drug development to be successful, we need to collaborate and work together. And I think one of the best examples of this is we work with diagnostic companies to help families get diagnostic and genetic testing, but then we also make sure that they're linked up with the community once they get that result, so they are able to have some support from the very start. Today, I'm going to talk about the main focus, obviously, is what we need to do to get ready for clinical trial. But I want to step back and talk a little bit about what is a clinical trial? What does it look like? What's the process? How is it different than just going to the doctors? And the reason why I want to do this first is I'm hoping that throughout this, you can hear all the little areas that you as a community can contribute to shaping these clinical trials when it comes time. And then I'm going to talk about what we can do now to get ready for these trials, specifically focused on the clinical and patient information aspect. And I know you've heard a little bit about that today, but I really want to help dive into the whys. Why are we asking you for all of this stuff, and how does it really contribute? And then I think we're going to do a larger Q&A at the end. Let's jump into the clinical trial piece. So these are the phases of a clinical trial, but before we can even start doing these things, we need to do 1 to 2 years of what we call preclinical development. And this is working in animals to determine if a drug is safe in humans. And also during this time, we develop what we call a manufacturing platform. And this is to make sure that when we make the drug, we make it the same way every time. And this speaks to kind of a theme that you'll keep hearing when I talk about clinical trials. And this is around the concept of control. We want to make sure that when we do a clinical trial, we're controlling as many things as we can, variables, to make sure that when we see a change, it's attributed to the treatment and not something else. So thinking about manufacturing, we want to make sure it's done the same way every time. So that way, when we see a change, we're thinking, oh, it's because of the treatment, not because a drug was made differently at different times. Also, before we start the phase 1, we go to regulators, so the FDA, and in other countries, things like the EMA, and they agree on our plan for our trials. So we start with phase 1, and I'm going to talk right now about just kind of the traditional path that clinical trials go down, and I'll talk about how it's different in rare disease in a moment. So in phase 1, it's really focused on safety. So you take healthy volunteers and you determine the safest dose for those patients. And if that's successful, you move on to phase 2, and that's determining, is the treatment effective in the disorder or disease of interest? And if that also is successful, you move on to phase 3. And this is really where you're testing, is this the most effective treatment in an area? So if we have, we're testing it sometimes compared to other treatments. So thinking of asthma, we've got a ton of treatments out there. So you may compare a new treatment against something that exists, or you may compare a new treatment against a placebo or a nothing pill. And these studies are what we call randomized and double blind. And what that means is patients don't have an option of which group they go into. They're either placed in the new treatment group or the existing or placebo group. And then the double blind means that neither a physician nor the patient knows which group they're in until the very end. And the reason we do this is, again, back to that control piece. we want to make sure that there's something called the placebo effect isn't happening. And that's when somebody gets a new treatment or thinks they're getting a new treatment and they tend to feel a little better because of this. Or a physician may think, oh, they're getting the new treatment and think this is all unconscious, not like actually happening, but then the physician may think, oh, they look a little bit better. And then if that is successful, you get to regulatory approval. And then we have those phase 4 studies. And this is really looking at long-term effects and safety. This whole process, depending on the study design, the treatment that you're looking at, can take about 4 to 7 years to approval. When we look at rare disease, because we're looking at such a tiny population with an unmet need and no existing treatment, typically that phase 1 and 2 is combined together. So you're looking at your dose level and safety within the group of interest. And when that's successful, you then move on again to those phase 3 programs that are double-blind and randomized. Because there is no existing treatment, some of those studies have what we call a wait list group. And so the group might wait and get the treatment later after a first group. And then again, you move on to phase 4. And then before a treatment can be made widely available, regulatory approval needs to happen. So again, going back to the EMA or FDA, and this process can take around 1 to 2 years. What makes a clinical trial different than just going to your doctor? Well, there are a couple different aspects that I can talk about. And the first is really entry. There's a limited number of slots available at each of those different phases. So not everybody who wants to participate will be able to. There's also a screening period typically at the beginning of these trials. And what that is basically doing some assessments to determine if you're eligible for the trial. Again, going back to that control piece, we want to make sure that everybody entering the trial looks kind of similar. Also, at the start of a trial, you'll complete what's called an informed consent form. And this really walks through all the different things that will happen in a trial and what would be expected of you and your family. The next are visits. So when you think about visits in a clinical trial, everything is what we call protocol driven. So everything has to be done in a specific order, in a specific way, at a specific time. Again, control. So this might mean that you're asked to continue doing something that you might be doing, like taking a medication. You might be asked to continue doing that throughout the trial. You might be asked not to start new medication when you're in the trial. You may be asked to, if you're doing PT assessments, keep doing that in the trial. But if you're not doing PT assessments, you may be asked to not do that if you start the trial. So we just want to make sure that everything kind of stays the same throughout. When we talk about the timing, it's super crucial because we want to make sure, again, that all those assessments are being done at the same time so we can attribute any change to treatment. So for example, say you're doing a motor assessment and you're asked to come in X number of days after you start treatment. Well, if you come in, say, a month after that specific date, there could be a change. But again, we have the question of, was it the time or the treatment? We want to make sure to take that out of the picture. You may be doing more visits than you're used to from a typical, just a routine year. And that's because we want to make sure that not only is it effective, but is it safe, and monitoring that throughout. And then you may see new or different assessments. So some of the things that we use in a clinic to either track patients over time or do for diagnosis aren't rigorous enough to be used in a clinical trial. So a different assessment may be used than you're used to. And then finally, location. So clinical trials, we try to pick a physician that is not only versed in the technology that we're using, but also is familiar with the patients enough to do those assessments. So it may be at a different location than you're used to or a different physician. And also it could require in-home assessments. So I think one of the things that's really come out of COVID is a lot of studies now have a mix of kind of clinic assessments and then things done at home. And that's because when COVID happened, basically all these trials had to come to a stop because we had no way to do assessments. And so now companies are trying to be, I think, not only more flexible to keep the trials running, but also hearing feedback from patients around the in-home stuff is actually less burdensome. It's a lot easier for us. But I think this varies trial by trial, and it's all things to consider when you're evaluating whether a clinical trial is a good fit for your family or not. A lot. I just really touched a high level, but I wanted to provide this website because anyone who conducts a clinical trial has to register their trial at this website. And it's a nice searchable database that gives you kind of a great picture of what different trials look like. You can search by disorder, you can search by location, and it breaks down, the website breaks down kind of eligibility criteria and gives you a good picture. There's also a nice area where you can learn more about clinical trials for patients and families. Let's talk about what do we need to do now to get ready for these trials. And I hope you heard throughout that there's different areas that you have as a community to influence how these trials are going to be designed and what they'll look like. So before I get into this, I want to kind of acknowledge that we know that you're juggling a lot. And right now the community is doing a heavy lift because a lot of the information that we're asking for has to come directly from you. And I'd like to kind of pause before I get into all the stuff I want to ask to really talk about the why, because I feel like the why is at the center of all the things that we do. And the main why is all the information we need, and the best way to make sure that these trials are designed with you at the center of it is to get the information from your community. So that's the reason why you're getting asked all these different things, interviews, all these different pieces, is because we really want to hear from you what that looks like. And let me kind of break down a little bit how some of this early data helps inform some of those studies. So we talk about accurate patient numbers. When we know how many people are in a community, it helps researchers when they ask for funding to be able to make the case of how that funding is going to have a large impact on this community. When we think about different drug development companies, it's kind of the same way, being able to show that not only are there large patient numbers, but there's also a community that's already active and involved. They're willing to enroll in a trial once it starts up. For my own personal bias, I think the most important thing is endpoint outcome selection and getting your feedback on what is most clinically meaningful from your families. Doing some of these projects, like we talk about the interview projects, that's really where you have a chance to talk about the endpoints that are most meaningful, what you want to see changed in a treatment, what assessments you think don't work and you don't want to see in a trial. I'm sure all of you right now can think of things that you do in clinic that you're like, please do not make me do that over and over again in a trial. That's kind of the feedback we want to hear from you. The other thing is around trial locations. When we know where patients are, we can then pick locations that are central to the biggest group of patients. Or if we see a physician that keeps coming up over and over again, we then know that that's a physician that the community is familiar with. And we want to work with them to make sure that that's where trial sites are located at. And then I think most importantly is a feasible study design. In my research, one of the main things I'm asking families is, what would be a barrier to treatment? What do you need to make sure that when you get into a trial, like it would be most convenient for you? And these are conversations that we try to have as much as we can before we even start designing the trial. I'm going to break into some of the different things that I'm sure you guys have heard about, but kind of hopefully again explaining the why and how these contribute to the design. So the first thing is a registry. I think most of you have probably heard of this. So we have the contact registry, which is being done by the patient group. And really what this is doing is basically collecting names of people. And for what this does is it helps give us back to that patient location piece as well as patient number piece. The other thing it helps with is, say a new study comes out or a new research project comes out, it gives a way to kind of reach out and contact individuals so that way they are aware of it. You can also have more in-depth research, registries like the Rare X design. And that is really a nice way to get a snapshot in time, a retrospective data of what it's like to be a parent. And I have a typo in here. Both of them are actually open to all families. So, and you can get information on how to sign up on the website. We talked about Citizen, now in Vitae, which I will probably always call it Citizen because I'm horrible at changing company names. But this is a nice platform that you can upload your medical records to. You give them information, they'll go and upload it, and then they'll refresh it every 6 months. So you have access to all of that in one central location. From a researcher perspective, what it does is it de-identifies this data and it provides it back to us so we can actually get a really nice picture of the medical journey that you've gone through. So from diagnosis to treatment, how many different tests were done to get a diagnosis? How long did it take? What kind of treatments have been successful? What haven't? Are there assessments that have been done that work, that don't work? So this is really helpful for us in kind of getting a nice natural history picture. But it also tells us as well, do we need a more in-depth natural history, which I'll talk about in a second, or is this enough? So Citizen is currently only open to US families right now. They do plan to expand to more families in the future. And I'm certain when that happens, there'll be information about that on the website. Natural history studies. So natural history studies, when we think about these are more observational studies, and they look at retrospective as well as prospective data. And these are designed a lot like a clinical trial in that they have a protocol, they have a schedule of assessments, they're posted on clinicaltrials.gov. So if you want to go and look and see what some natural history studies look like, there's some out there. But the reason why they're designed so rigorously is because in some cases, they can be used as a comparator arm when we design a clinical trial. So the nice thing about it is a lot of them now are being done online. So I'm sorry, not online as well as in home. So it makes them a little bit less burdensome than going to the clinic, all those different assessment times. And it really helps inform our trial design by not only understanding kind of, again, patient assessments, but also what's feasible. So this is where in the past, I've done natural history studies where I've been debating about using a different device in a study. And so I've given it to a family to try out over 7 days, and they got feedback of like, is this something that you could do at home, or is this something that's just not feasible for your family? But they're super helpful when we go to the regulatory agencies to really support our filing efforts. There are none currently being done right now within the community, but I'm sure if one happens, it'll be on the website. And if you do sign up for that contact registry, it would also be on that as well. And then finally, we have what we call a conceptual model of disease. And these are kind of the foundation of what we use when we build out kind of the endpoints that we use in a trial. And some of you may have participated in this project already, because what they really involve are interviews with families that pull out what are the symptoms and areas of impact of interest. And then we take those interviews, they get transcribed, and it builds out a model of concepts of these symptoms and areas of impact to show what is most clinically meaningful. And for me, when I go to the FDA and show them a study design, this is what they want to see with it. They want to make sure that at the center of our study design, we have patients, we have patient input, and that anything that we're choosing to measure is meaningful to a family. So I think this right here is like one of the best activities to get involved with if you really want to have your voice heard and shape what those trials look like, because this is really what helps to facilitate that whole decision-making process around what we're measuring in a trial. And so I know that there's already been one round of these done. I think there's going to be another call for interviews. So I highly encourage you to participate, because this is really a great opportunity, not invasive. It's a nice way to tell your story and really contribute to this. Okay, so that is, I kind of went through what happens in a clinical trial and how you can have a voice in contributing to these trials and all the different aspects that you can do now to get ready for them. And hopefully you heard that you can have a voice in shaping them. This isn't just a nebulous process that happens with someone designing it without you in mind. And that is it.